Porsche has been lightly refreshing its Panamera range, and this particular one remains the pinnacle of the pricing structure. It is the £142,000 Panamera Turbo S E-Hybrid Sport Turismo, here in volcano grey metallic paint. The changes are subtle, but they include slightly different C-shaped daytime running lights, a new continuous light bar at the rear, an additional 19 brake horsepower and 15 pounds-foot from the 4-litre twin-turbo V8 under the bonnet, a higher capacity battery beneath the boot floor, new wheel designs, new tyres, tweaked suspension settings, a higher resolution for the PCM display, and Sport Chrono as standard. But is it any different to drive? Well, let's start with the electric-only e-power mode.
On battery power alone, we've got 134 brake horsepower and 295 pounds-foot of torque, which is, well, pretty ample for most of the sort of journeys you want to do on electric power. I feel like since I drove the last iteration of this car, hybrids have become more pertinent. Certainly in the UK, where obviously we've had it announced that they want to ban all new petrol and diesel cars by 2030, so hybrids like this will still be allowable. But also I've had quite a few friends who don't feel like they're ready for a full electric car as their next new car, but still want to be conscious a lot of their sort of journeys around town. Perhaps they'd like to be zero emissions, so a hybrid like this actually makes quite a lot of sense. The battery in here has now gone from a 14.1 kilowatt hour battery to a 17.9 kilowatt hour battery, so the range has increased by up to 30% across the various hybrid Panameras that you can get. So that's 4S or the Turbo S E-Hybrid that we've got here, because, well, we'll get to the performance bit later on.
That new battery gives a 50 kilometre or 31 mile maximum electric only range according to WLTP figures, but that equates to 59 kilometres or just over 36.5 miles under the old NEDC testing procedures.
Driving this around, it just feels like the electric is more resolved. It doesn't feel like it wants to jump in and use the internal combustion engine quite as much as it did before. Maximum torque arrives when you've got 50% of the accelerator pedal depressed, and then the internal combustion engine will kick in if you're in e-power mode when you reach 60% of the throttle. So you've got a little bit of leeway there, just because otherwise you don't want to be sort of trying to accelerate as hard as you can but fearful of kicking in with the engine. And I think overall it works very well actually. Porsche has also worked hard with this model to improve the way that it recharges the battery. So when you're on the go, you've got a couple of options here. You've got e-charge down here, and that will charge it up to just over 7 kilowatts when you're going along, or 12 actually if you're in Sport Plus.
Porsche has actually revised the target charge level of the battery down from 100% to 80%, so that it doesn't waste energy trying to charge that reluctant last 20%.
You've also got e-hold, so that means you can conserve what battery power you've got. So if you say you're about to go into a city and you don't want to be using it up on the way there, just use the combustion engine, and then when you get to a low emission zone, use the battery when you get there. So e-hold works quite well for that. The other benefit, obviously, of having a hybrid and having a relatively small battery is that it's much easier, or makes much more sense, charging it at home. You don't have to rely on the perhaps slightly unreliable wider charging network. I've obviously also got night vision on here. I'm not really sure when you use night vision, but it's quite fun.
Anyway, as cool and Blade Runner-esque as it is moving silently through a city on a foggy night, I actually think that the future might not consist purely of electric cars. There is, you might say, light at the end of the tunnel, or a new dawn on the horizon for the internal combustion engine.
Well, it's a bit lighter, I suppose. You see, in the press release for the Panamera Turbo S E-Hybrid Sport Turismo, it's a mouthful, isn't it? There was 2.5 pages devoted to e-fuels. Now, e-fuels are sort of nothing new, at least the concept of them, but this is the first time that I've seen a manufacturer really say they're going to investigate and invest in e-fuels.
What are e-fuels? Well, the brief version is that you take water, preferably desalinized seawater so that you don't affect sources used for drinking, then you subject it to electrolysis. This means passing an electrical current through H2O to separate out the hydrogen. Obviously, the electricity used for this should be from a local, renewable source. You then combine the hydrogen with carbon dioxide, which can be captured from the air or industry, and in the process you create e-methanol, which can then be converted into very pure forms of petrol or diesel, or kerosene for the aviation industry.
These can then go straight into a conventional combustion engine, and of course, whilst they will then emit CO2, it's only equivalent to the CO2 that was used to produce the fuel in the first place. So it's what's known as a closed loop.
The other advantage, of course, is that you can use the existing infrastructure to distribute these liquid fuels.
Brilliant, you might think. Let's crack on with this. Well, there are a few problems. Obviously, you're still expending CO2, so in low emission zones, the battery electric vehicles certainly have their place. Also, the process for extracting the hydrogen is complicated and expensive. So at the moment, they reckon fuels would probably cost 3 to 4 times what they do at the moment. However, as a solution to being able to keep things like GT3s going, or motorsport, things like rallying, obviously close to my heart, where you need a car making some noise going through a forest because it's simply not safe otherwise, e-fuels really do present a golden opportunity. All those classic cars that we'd love to be able to keep going, things like the Goodwood Revival meeting, that could still exist using e-fuels. Anyway, back to this specific car. What's it like to drive? Well, as you might expect, very much like the old one. Although power and torque have only crept up just incrementally really, we've now got 691 brake horsepower available. And that number's sort of significant because it now puts it on a par with the 991 GT2 RS. It's madness. We've got 642 pounds-foot of torque, so that's 90 pounds-foot more than the GT2 RS. Yes, I know it's a lot heavier, but still, I mean, for a sort of luxury car that can cruise around on electric power only, that's quite a lot of performance. Porsche says it's made tweaks to the software and the steering, so it's taken experience from the 911 Carrera, the 992, and the Taycan. And the steering is better actually. It's still not a sort of a really interactive car. You're obviously going to always feel a little bit removed, but as you go through the corners, there's definitely just a bit more tactility to the steering. And with all assistance, you really feel like it's a much smaller car, a car that you're happy to chuck around in a way that you just wouldn't think.
The front wheels are not the only wheels doing some steering, because rear axle steering now comes as standard on this car, as do PDCC, that's Porsche Dynamic Chassis Control, and Porsche Torque Vectoring Plus, all of which no doubt partially accounts for the 40 kilo increase in the official EU curb weight to a mighty hefty 2,440 kilos.
Through the corners it does obviously feel like a big car, but it shrinks around you, and actually it's surprisingly accurate and fun down a road. Also sounds really good in Sport Plus, this turbocharged 4-litre V8, which is obviously somewhat ubiquitous across the VAG range, but I'm not sure it sounds better anywhere than in here. This car's party trick has to be its launch control, because, well, you find a quiet piece of road and that is just bonkers. I've never experienced a steam catapult launching a jet off an aircraft carrier, but I imagine that's akin to what it would feel like. The massive thump as you come off the brakes is quite fun. And yet weirdly, you don't get the same slightly uncomfortable feeling that you do when you launch an electric car. Odd, isn't it?
The actual 0 to 60 mile an hour time, by the way, has dropped by 0.2 seconds to just 3.2 seconds, while top speed has gone up from 193 to 196 miles an hour.
So there we are. That is the new-ish Panamera Turbo S E-Hybrid Sport Turismo. Not a lot has changed, but what it represents, or perhaps what the press release for this car represents, it's actually quite encouraging.